And now, the Deeper Thinking Podcast, a space for ideas and reflections in our uncertain times.
Welcome to the Deeper Thinking Podcast. Loneliness is often framed as a personal affliction, a quiet ache, a missing presence, a failure of intimacy. But what if it signals something deeper, a rupture in the systems that sustain our ability to relate? This essay reimagines loneliness not as an individual deficit, but as a structural, ecological, and ontological condition. Drawing from thinkers across systems theory, deep ecology, posthumanism, and feminist philosophy, it explores how disconnection has become the architecture of modern life, reflected in our social patterns, our technologies, and our relationship to the natural world. Through this lens, loneliness emerges not simply from being alone, but from living in a world that has thinned its sense of mutuality. What once connected us, ritual, kinship, rhythm, place, has been replaced by speed, transaction, and simulation. The result is a society saturated with contact but starved of resonance. By tracing insights from ecological science to spiritual ecology and from ontological critique to emotional labour, this essay maps the terrain of a culture estranged from itself. Rather than offering a cure, it invites a return to presence, to slowness, to listening, to interdependence. Through the echoes of grief, desire, and collective vulnerability, it asks what it might mean to dwell within our entanglement rather than escape it. This is not an essay of resolution, but of recursion, where the path back to connection is neither linear nor complete, but alive, unfinished, and held together by the fragile weave of relation itself. To speak of loneliness today is not simply to name a feeling, but to describe a shift in ontological architecture. Martin Heidegger, in his writing on being in the world, insisted that our existence is always already embedded, thrown into a context that we did not choose. And yet modern loneliness seems to arise precisely from the erasure of this embeddedness. What was once a given, connection to others, to place, to seasons, has become something to be scheduled, managed, or outsourced. In an era that promises limitless freedom, we are discovering the cost of disconnection. The paradox is sharp. Infinite choice leads to infinite solitude. The more we move, scroll, swipe, and optimize, the less we seem to belong. Gregory Bateson's systems theory framed relationships as patterns of interaction that sustain identity across time. He wrote that the unit of survival is not the organism or the species, but the organism plus its environment. If we take this seriously, then loneliness is not an internal defect, but a sign of ecological breakdown, a signal that the system of interrelations which once held us is fraying. The modern individual, imagined as sovereign and self-contained, becomes unsustainable when removed from the webs that once gave them coherence. The breakdown of mutual obligation, of community as structure rather than aesthetic, renders the self fragile, floating, disoriented. The rise of what Eva Luz calls emotional capitalism only deepens this drift. In a culture where intimacy becomes transactional and desire is formatted by algorithm, the relational becomes a commodity. We do not encounter others, we browse them. Even care begins to mimic the logic of extraction. What can I get from this? What will it cost? The tender complexity of reciprocity is flattened by a culture allergic to ambiguity. Jacques Derrida's reflections on hospitality remind us that true relation always involves risk, uncertainty, and a certain openness to the stranger. But the culture of convenience teaches avoidance. The relational is replaced by the reliable. What can be messy and alive is instead clean and programmable. There is a countercurrent, however, that runs quietly through certain philosophies of ecology. Donna Haraway's concept of staying with the trouble invites us to reimagine relationality not as a clean escape from complexity, but as a practice of being with, even when that with is unstable or unresolved. To feel lonely is to feel the gap between what is and what could be, but it is also to register the memory of connection. In this sense, loneliness can be ecological, not the absence of people, but the absence of mutualism, not the lack of contact, but the erosion of care systems that hold us in reciprocity. Attention, as Weil conceived it, is not merely a tool for connection. It is a discipline of being with. It resists utility. It demands stillness. And in a world driven by speed, attention becomes subversive. The philosopher Byung-Chul Han explores this further in Burnout Society, where he describes how the compulsion toward productivity and self-optimization leads not to freedom but exhaustion. When relationships are framed through the lens of achievement, whether emotional, romantic, or ecological, they become performative rather than participatory. We lose the texture of interaction. Even care is timed, measured, and evaluated. Han's critique makes clear: a culture obsessed with selfhood cannot sustain interdependence. Connection collapses under the weight of constant self-display. In opposition to this collapse, indigenous knowledge systems offer a relational ontology in which being is always co-being. The work of Leanne Bettersomer-Sack-Simpson articulates a politics of presence that is deeply ecological, emphasizing that relationships with people, land, ancestors, future generations are not optional moral add-ons, but the very conditions of life. Within Nishnabeg traditions, for example, intimacy is practiced through reciprocity and seasonal responsibility, not abstract sentiment. The health of the whole emerges from the integrity of the parts. This framework does not ask, "What do I want?" but what is needed of me. The difference is transformative. It repositions the self from consumer to caretaker. This shift becomes essential when examining the dominance of anthropocentric narratives. The philosopher Val Plumwood warned against the mastery model, where humans are imagined as separate from and superior to the natural world. Such a model, she argued, underlies both ecological destruction and relational failure. If we approach others, human or non-human, as resources rather than relations, then isolation is inevitable. Loneliness is not an aberration of modern life, it is its logical conclusion. To refuse mastery is not to embrace helplessness, but to adopt a posture of humility. To understand that interdependence is not weakness, but the architecture of survival. Even language reflects our drift from mutualism. Roland Barthes, in A Lover's Discourse, notes how speech becomes distorted when desire is unshared. The monologue replaces the dialogue. One speaks into absence, hoping to conjure response. In ecological terms, this maps onto our current condition. We speak to the earth, but do not listen. We extract rather than converse. Barthes' insight reframes loneliness as not just absence, but asymmetry, a failure of listening, a failure of echo. And yet within that failure, there is also the outline of remedy. Listening, as method, not metaphor, invites a different kind of presence. In the work of Maurice Merleau-Ponty, perception is always embodied, entangled, incomplete. To sense is not to dominate, but to be touched. This offers an ethics of contact. To be in relationship is to be open to alteration. The world is not there to confirm us, it is there to transform us. Transformation, then, must begin at the smallest scale. Adrienne Marie Brown's emergent strategy insists that what we practice at the small scale sets the pattern for the whole system. This is not sentiment, it is systems logic. If ecosystems are networks of feedback, then healing must begin where disrepair is most intimate. A conversation, a pause, a hand held too long. We imagine systemic repair as grand gesture, but Brown reminds us that the macro emerges from the micro. If the climate crisis is a crisis of relationship, then the repair of the planet begins with how we relate to strangers, to silence, to soil. The scale shrinks, but the consequence expands. Ashon Crawley offers another lens through which to view this relational reconstitution. In Black Pentecostal Breath, he proposes that breath is not private but shared, that every exhale is a collective act. Breath becomes theology, philosophy, resistance. In a world shaped by suffocation, literal and figurative, breathing together becomes political. Crawley's work invites us to notice the sacred in the ordinary, the communal in the unnoticed. Loneliness here becomes not simply a lack of company, but a foreclosure of breath's potential, the social act of respiration lost to isolation. Michel Serres, in his writing on noise, suggests that parasitism is not deviation, but origin. Every system begins with a disturbance. This reframes the unwanted, the glitch, the rupture, the outsider as generative. Loneliness, then, is not only a deficit but a signal, a rupture that can become recursion. If we attend to the parasite, what interrupts us, we may find the outline of a new relation. In this way, even pain becomes pedagogical. What hurts may teach us how to reweave. Rosie Braidotti's posthumanist theory extends this further by challenging the very centrality of the individual. The subject, she argues, is always a collective assemblage of enunciation. We are not discrete, but porous. We do not speak, we are spoken through. Identity, then, is less possession than process. When loneliness strikes, it may be the friction of an identity resisting its own expansion. If we are assemblages, then our suffering must be addressed collectively. No one heals alone. No one truly breaks alone. Returning to the ecological frame, Robin Wall Kimmerer's work in Braiding Sweetgrass offers the possibility of gratitude as connective tissue. She writes that reciprocity is not an obligation but a joy, a way of participating in abundance rather than managing scarcity. In this light, loneliness is not just a sign of social famine but of forgotten generosity. To give thanks is to return to relation, not as transaction but as orientation. The self becomes less a sovereign and more a steward, and the world, no longer a mirror, becomes a partner in ongoing transformation. This transformation demands not only new practices, but new myths. Sylvia Wynter's critique of the overrepresented man exposes the dangers of a universal subject that claims to be neutral while erasing the multiplicity of ways to be human. When the relational field is narrowed to this dominant subject, rational, self-interested, detached, then other modes of knowing and being are silenced. Loneliness in this context is not incidental but engineered. It emerges from the compression of difference. To heal it, we must recover the suppressed ontologies that value relation over dominance, plurality over purity. Amid this recovery, we encounter the work of Felix Guattari and his concept of ecosophy, a triadic ecological vision that includes the environment, social relations, and mental life. These three ecologies are not separate. A damaged psychic ecology manifesting as chronic loneliness, apathy, or hyper-individualism cannot be isolated from ecological destruction or fractured social structures. Guattari's framework insists on simultaneity, that to address environmental collapse without addressing the psychic conditions of late capitalism is to treat a symptom while feeding the disease. In this triadic view, relational repair becomes ecological strategy. Even architecture reflects this. In The Eyes of the Skin, Juhani Pallasmaa critiques the dominance of visual abstraction in modern design. Spaces, he argues, have lost their sensuality. We are building worlds that can be seen but not felt. Loneliness proliferates in such sterile environments. Structures that discourage encounter, flatten acoustics, erase thresholds. A room designed for surveillance is not a room designed for intimacy. And yet form can be reclaimed, a bench that invites pause, a hallway that curves gently, a window that frames not the city but the sky. These are not aesthetic flourishes, but philosophical gestures. They remind us that relationship begins with presence. David Abram, drawing from phenomenology and animist traditions, speaks of the more-than-human world, a realm where rocks, rivers, winds and animals are not backdrop but interlocutors. When we exclude them from our field of relation, we shrink our sense of companionship to the human only. No wonder we feel alone. Abram's work suggests that reconnection is not solely social but sensory. It is the rediscovery of a world that speaks, if we learn again to listen. And finally, Bell Hooks reminds us that love is not a feeling but an ethic. In All About Love, she frames love as the will to extend oneself for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. Applied to ecological, social and romantic terrains, this definition insists on commitment beyond convenience. To love another person, a community, a coastline is to enter into responsibility. Loneliness cannot persist in a world where love is practiced as ongoing labour, not a fleeting sentiment. And so, the return to interdependence is not a regression. It is a repair, a remembering, a return to the oldest truth we keep forgetting, that we were never meant to go alone. To remember that truth is to dwell in what Karen Barad calls intra-action, a term that refuses the idea of independent entities interacting and instead proposes that entities emerge through their relations. In this view, self and other, subject and environment are not pre-existing categories but co-constituted through entanglement. Loneliness, then, is not merely the absence of others. It is the breakdown of the relational fields that allow us to become at all. Healing loneliness is not about adding people into the void, but reweaving the conditions through which subjectivity can form in shared space. The self becomes less a fortress, more a phenomenon of participation. From this entangled perspective, the work of Arne Næss becomes newly urgent. His theory of deep ecology calls for an expansion of the self that includes the wider natural world. What we typically understand as altruism, caring for trees, oceans, animals, is refigured as enlightened self-interest. If the river is part of me, then its poisoning is a form of self-harm. This logic collapses the false dichotomy between care for self and care for other. It reframes ecological concern not as guilt or sacrifice, but as an act of integration. The lonely subject becomes a relic of shallow perception, supplanted by a self that extends into soil and sky. But deep ecology also demands reckoning with grief. Judith Butler's reflections on vulnerability in precarious life insist that to be a self is to be exposed to loss, to rupture, to the contingency of every bond. We mourn not only people but possibilities, futures, and the stability of relational ground. Butler invites us to consider mourning not as private sadness but as a political act, a refusal to forget what once connected us. Grief in this register becomes a mode of allegiance, a form of remembering that remakes the social. In remaking the social, we must also remake our language. Edouard Glissant's notion of opacity challenges the demand to be legible. In a culture that prizes clarity and classification, opacity is radical. It resists the drive to render others knowable, predictable, extractable. In relational terms, this means allowing others, human and more than human alike, to remain partially unknown. The refusal to dominate is the beginning of a different kind of intimacy, one where mystery is not a threat but a condition of respect. This respect is what Achille Mbembe gestures toward in his call for planetary entanglement, a politics rooted not in territorial domination but in shared vulnerability. The planet, he argues, is not a resource but a relation. To stand on it is to be held by it, and to forget that is to court annihilation. Loneliness in this becomes more than emotional, it becomes civilizational, an entire worldview estranged from its grounds. To reweave connection is thus not only personal work, it is species work, worldview work, survival work. Species work at its core is mythic, not in the sense of fabrication, but in the sense of scale. As David Graeber and David Wengrow argue in The Dawn of Everything, the story we tell about civilization, isolated units competing for survival, hierarchy as inevitable, disconnection as progress, is not the only story available. They trace social formations that thrived on fluid identity, ritual reciprocity, and seasonal variation in authority. These are not utopias, but alternatives, histories that widen our sense of what relation can mean. If loneliness is framed as the unavoidable cost of modernity, these histories fracture that narrative. They remind us that social complexity and mutual care are not incompatible, that other ways have existed, that they might again. Anne Carson, in Eros the Bittersweet, writes that longing is not the absence of union but the awareness of distance. That Eros, the pulse of desire, is made not of fulfillment but of the interval. This reframing is vital because it shifts the work of connection from conquest to presence. The lonely do not lack relation, they feel its stretch. The work, then, is not always to shorten the gap, but to tend it, to inhabit the distance without collapsing it. Carson's insight teaches us to honour the ache, not as failure, but as the mark of a living system still capable of sensing the space between. From this ache comes a kind of listening that philosopher Gemma Corradi-Fiumara calls the unthought known. In The Other Side of Language, she argues that Western epistemology privileges speaking over listening, presence over absence, articulation over silence. But it is in the quiet, what is not yet or no longer said, that deeper knowing resides. Loneliness, in this sense, may be not a deficit, but a tuning, a form of receptivity that opens us to the frequencies of what exceeds language. Fiumara's theory urges a return to slowness, to the kind of hearing that allows the other to arrive in their own rhythm. Slowness is also central to the slow movement, articulated by Carl Honoré and others, which proposes that depth, sustainability and connection are only possible when we reject speed as virtue. Applied to relationships, slowness becomes an ethic, to allow love to unfold, not be optimized, to let friendship evolve, not be scheduled. Slowness makes room for ambiguity, for cycles of retreat and return. Without it, connection hardens into transaction, and loneliness once again becomes not absence but exhaustion. In exhaustion, we circle back to ecology. Vandana Shiva's work on seed sovereignty reminds us that monoculture, whether in agriculture, culture, or relation, breeds vulnerability. Diversity, even when difficult, is what sustains. The same holds true for human ties. To be surrounded only by those who mirror us is a kind of starvation. It is difference, nourishing, dissonant, surprising, that expands our capacity to belong. In this light, to be connected is not to be surrounded, but to be porous, not to be confirmed, but to be changed. To be changed is to be vulnerable, and vulnerability is the condition of all authentic relation. Levinas placed the face of the other at the heart of ethical life, not as mirror, but as interruption. The face does not confirm our worldview, it disturbs it. This disturbance, he argued, is precisely what obliges us. We do not become ethical through agreement, but through exposure. Loneliness in this frame arises when we lose access to the ethical claim of the other, not because they are absent, but because we no longer see. The face disappears into function. The other is flattened into role. What is lost is not company, but encounter. In the context of digital life, this flattening is profound. Sherry Turkle's work on mediated intimacy explores how our technologies offer contact without risk, communication without confrontation. We send text rather than speak. We curate presence rather than inhabit it. Over time, the affective range of our connections narrows. Loneliness becomes not the result of isolation, but of simulation. We simulate relation and wonder why we do not feel held. We mistake the glow of the screen for the warmth of the body. But the screen does not interrupt, it reflects. It cannot destabilize or surprise. Against this simulation, Gaston Bachelard's The Poetics of Space offers an architecture of intimacy. Bachelard writes not about buildings, but about corners, nests, drawers, the spaces where memory and imagination meet. These micro-domains of experience, he suggests, shape how we relate to the world and to ourselves. Loneliness often arises not in the lack of people, but in the erosion of such spaces. When the home becomes a workplace, when time becomes fragmented, when the self has nowhere to rest, it frays. Reclaiming intimacy may thus require not more socialization, but different kinds of space, spaces that hold, that slow, that listen. In holding, we return to ritual. Mircea Eliade emphasized that ritual was not merely symbolic, but cosmological. It bound the human to the order of the world. Rituals mark time, named transition and reaffirmed place. Their erosion in secular life has left a vacuum. Birth, death, grief, joy. Without ritual, these become personal burdens rather than communal processes. Loneliness festers in this absence. To restore ritual is not nostalgia, it is resynchronization. With each other, with the planet, with the mystery. Ultimately, we arrive at the question, what sustains us? Not what entertains or distracts, but what allows the self to remain open in a closing world. In Hope in the Dark, Rebecca Solnit writes that hope is not naivete but commitment to remain attentive to what might still become. Loneliness may be what signals the gap, but hope is what refuses to seal it. And so we linger in the interval. We wait, not passively, but with reverence. We practice connection in the dark. We keep tending the web. And yet, to tend the web is to accept its fragility. Judith Butt's later work on cohabitation reminds us that living together, across identities, across species, across histories, is not grounded in shared belief, but in shared precarity. We are not united by consensus, but by the fact that we are each exposed to loss, to harm, to interruption. This reconceptualization of the social does not offer comfort, it offers responsibility. Loneliness in this schema is not a flaw in personal life, but a symptom of withdrawn responsibility. A society becomes lonely when it forgets its interdependence, when it abandons the infrastructures of shared care that make cohabitation bearable. Frantz Fanon, writing from the wound of colonialism, also spoke to the psychic cost of disconnection. In Black Skin, White Masks, he described how systemic rupture fractures the relational mirror, how the colonized subject learns to see themselves through the distorted gaze of the colonizer. Fanon's concern was political, but the emotional terrain he described remains relevant. Disconnection is not merely between people, it is within the self, across the social, down into the historical. Loneliness is not only solitude, it is estrangement from one's own reflection, one's place in a world that has unmade its links. The sociologist Hartmut Rosa's concept of resonance speaks directly to this fractured link. Rosa argues that modern life has become unresponsive, not silent but echoless. We call out and nothing returns. Or worse, we receive only noise, metrics, notifications, surface replies. Resonance is what happens when the world speaks back, when we sense that our presence matters. Loneliness blooms in resonance deserts. Reconnection requires cultivating conditions under which the world can answer. Slowness, proximity, humility. It also requires relinquishing control. Resonance cannot be forced, it can only be invited. Alfred North Whitehead's process philosophy offers an ontological basis for this invitation. Reality, in his view, is not made of static objects but of events, ongoing processes of becoming, always in relation. To exist is to influence and be influenced. The isolated self is a metaphysical fiction. If being itself is relational, then loneliness is a rupture in process. The task is not to fix the self, but to restore flow, to re-enter the movement of becoming with. To trust again that transformation is not annihilation, but growth. And so, perhaps, the cure for modern loneliness is not certainty or even constant company, but a capacity for entangled presence, a reconfiguration of the self as a node in an infinite weave. Not central, not dominant, but held, touched, altered, and in turn capable of altering. To be capable of altering is to recognize one's participation in the ongoing composition of the world. Isabel Stenger's Building on Deleuze and Guattari frames thinking itself as an ecological act, a tuning to the rhythm of the world rather than a conquest over it. Thought, in this view, is relational. It listens, it adapts, it hesitates. Such a posture stands in sharp contrast to the instrumental rationality that drives both technological acceleration and emotional detachment. Loneliness, from this angle, becomes the residue of thought, divorced from the world it belongs to. Reconnection requires slowing the tempo of cognition, thinking with, not ahead of. Sara Ahmed's concept of orientation deepens this reflection. In queer phenomenology, she suggests that how we inhabit space shapes what we see and who we encounter. Loneliness is not only a matter of who is around, but how we are turned. One can be surrounded and misaligned, facing away from what might sustain. Orientation, then, is a relational ethics. It asks us to notice the patterns of turning that lead us again and again into solitude, and it offers the possibility that a different turn toward the unnoticed, the othered, the small might reroute experience entirely. In this rerouting, Audre Lorde's insistence that our silence will not protect us becomes a reminder that withholding ourselves from relation is not safety, but erasure. Loneliness often masquerades as self-protection. Better to be alone than to be wounded. But Lorde challenges this logic. Silence, disconnection, retreat, these do not shield us from harm, they ensure it. Her call is not toward indiscriminate exposure, but toward brave vulnerability, the kind that builds solidarity strong enough to endure difference, to be seen not perfectly, but faithfully, to speak not because we are sure, but because our words might help someone else find their way back to connection. Thomas Berry, the ecological theologian, named this connective return as the great work, the task of reimagining the human as part of a sacred earth community. This is not metaphor. For Berry, cosmology and ethics are entwined. How we explain our origins shapes how we behave. If we are random competitors, we consume. If we are kin in a living cosmos, we tend. Loneliness, then, is a cosmological problem, a sign that our origin stories no longer support our entanglement. To cure it, we need not more data, but new mythologies, ones in which interdependence is not weakness, but wisdom. And so we arrive at an old insight, that being together is not just what sustains life, but what makes it meaningful. Not just the absence of loneliness, but the texture of belonging, a resonance felt in the body, a rhythm shared across difference, a place, however fragile, to rest. Rest, finally, is where the work of relation begins again. Tricia Hersey's The Nap Ministry reframes rest not as recovery from labour, but as refusal of the systems that treat bodies as endless resources. Hersey calls rest a spiritual practice, an act of resistance, and a portal to dreaming, individually and collectively. Within a capitalist cosmology that measures worth through output, rest becomes transgressive. It disrupts the tempo of disposability and creates space for remembering. Loneliness in this framework is not only about absence of others, but the exhaustion that comes from being always available, always performing. To rest is to declare that we are already enough for relation to emerge. This declaration echoes in the work of Paulo Freire, who insisted that dialogue is not a technique, but an ontological necessity. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, he describes authentic dialogue as the meeting of subjects, each naming the world together. It is not extraction nor transmission, but co-creation. Freire's vision defies loneliness by grounding relation in mutual recognition and shared transformation. Education, in this sense, is not schooling, it is the cultivation of encounter, a conversation in which both speaker and listener are changed, a form of love with epistemological weight. Even science, when re-enchanted, begins to speak this language. Lynn Margulis's theory of endosymbiosis radically altered our understanding of evolution, not as a war of all against all, but as a history of intimacy. Life did not emerge through isolation, but through union. Eukaryotic cells, the building blocks of complex life, were born not from conquest, but from merging. This is not metaphor, it is biological fact. The very capacity to feel alone is built from ancient acts of togetherness. Our deepest structures remember. Connection is not an aspiration, it is origin. Returning to philosophy, Emmanuel Levinas insisted that ethics begins not in rules, but in the gaze of the other, and yet that gaze, to be transformative, must be met, which means we must be willing to look back. In a culture where eyes flicker across screens more than across faces, the mutual gaze becomes rare. Loneliness is not just what we feel when others do not see us. It is also what we feel when we no longer know how to look. To relearn this gaze, to meet it, hold it and remain, is to begin again the project of relation, not as resolution, not as cure, but as practice, a commitment to the unfinished, the tender repetition of presence, a return again and again to the space between, held open, not closed, not overcome, but honoured. A place where the self becomes porous, and in that porousness, less alone. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Deeper Thinking podcast. Today's episode was narrated by Holly, our digital narrator, who helps bring our ideas to life. For further reading, research, and ways to support the podcast, please visit the episode webpage. Thank you for your positive reviews on Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help keep us visible so others can discover and enjoy our content.